Looks like we're live. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Modern Apprenticeship, a model for tech, a long discussion on a short period of time on with our wonderful panelists that are joining us here today. First of all, I'd like to thank Louder Than 10 for organizing this right now and bringing a wonderful mix of people that I'm really looking forward to having this discussion with. As most of you know or are aware or care, apprenticeship is a difficult subject that hits various touch points in our careers and in our trajectories. And we know that employment is facing a bit of a crisis in respect to the retention, skills gap, student debt, collapsing middle class, less time or money to be waiting for a good paying job and tucking into contractual or freelance-based situations. What's fascinating is that apprenticeship is coming into this calling right now as a necessity. And we're seeing apprenticeship programs beginning, and it almost feels like we're reinventing a wheel. And I think we'd be remiss to not discuss why there's a sudden new calling for apprenticeships. First of all, let's celebrate that. Anytime you have an opportunity to mentor, there's this situation where you get to learn from those around you, regardless of the level of hierarchy. But more importantly, it's that level of experience. And experience goes a long way, whether it's minimal or a long seasoned veteran's career. And what I mean by that is that when people are asked the question, would you like a mentor? Would you like to be an apprentice? Unequivocally, especially in a passionate industry such as creativity or tech, there's this immediate hands up in the air. Everyone wants to have a mentor. Everyone wants to be an apprentice. So the question I give back to that individual holding their hand in the air is who are you currently mentoring? Who are you currently taking on board as an apprentice for you? And if your answer is, well, I don't know enough to be a mentor, then I'm going to call bull. Because no matter what level of experience you have just that much more than someone else. And for you to deny access to that information to another individual, you are becoming the person you despise as you were learning. So please keep that in mind. Keep that as a principle as we all learn and move forward. So tech hiring and onboarding is a difficult time right now. And why is that? Well, we've got this gap, this chasm between graduation or training and career. You know, how do we get into firms that we're looking at, agencies we wish to work for? What is that entry and gateway? And countless times we hear this, well, if only you had a little more experience. If only you had a little more knowledge. If only you had insert C, D, E, and F variations on that conversation. How do we address that? You know, do we go back to education as senior agency owners and say, I need you to do A, B, C, and D? Well, that's a bit of an arrogant move. And it's also very, very narrow-minded in focus and scope because it's specific to that particular agency at that time, potentially even a specific project. What I'd like to ask the question is, and have it kind of linger in the air with our panelists and as we address this moving forward, is where are our senior agency owners in defining an apprenticeship program, defining mentorship? And I'm going to call this out and say, sending the elevator back down. And I'll use the example of Kevin Spacey during the actors workshop, where he spent 6 weeks sharing everything he knew about his craft, his decades of commitment and drive and energy and knowledge, and shared that willingly and freely with those that were aspiring to be the next Kevin Spacey. And he was interviewed later and he was asked, like, why would you do that? Why would you give so much of yourself for free? And his response was amazing. He said, look, when you finally made it to that place you've only ever dreamt of being at, it is your obligation to send the elevator back down. And in that spirit of training and learning, I'd like to consider that our theme as we move forward and really define what a solid apprenticeship program is. And we know it's not just the educator, we know it's not just the apprentice, and we know it's not just the agency owner. It's all of us, all the time, with that clear vision of what's possible. And I ask you all to consider that as we move forward. I do want to take a few moments now just to introduce our panelists that are joining us here today. And first is Dan Mall, who's joining us from Philadelphia. Dan runs a design apprenticeship at Super Friendly. He's spoken on apprenticeship through 99U and on his own website. He's a prolific speaker and writer in the tech community and focuses on value-based billing and lean processes. And what you may not know about Dan is that he actually can't swim. And what we recently realized is that in Philadelphia, that's probably not a big deal. What we do know is that he can swim very well with the big fishes when it comes to teaching, learning, and growing. I'd like to introduce Becca James, who's joining us from Virginia, and she's a recent graduate of the Inhouse Viget Project Management Apprenticeship Program. And this is fantastic to have a recent graduate of a program who's had a year to implement her training within the agency environment. So looking forward to her experiences. And something about Becca outside of that spectrum you may not know at the time, when I didn't know until a few moments ago, and I really enjoyed learning this. She used to work for the Amtrak police. So just imagine that, CSI on the tracks. I really appreciate that. Our third panelist is Robert Mulholland, who's joining us from Chicago, and he is both was an apprentice and is now a mentor as a developer at 8th Light in Chicago. He spent a lot of his time as a college debate coach, which allows us incredible opportunity to share both like-minded thinking and challenging thoughts, because in a debate, and as we may even discover along the way here, is that you'll be sharing thoughts and feelings, and as you're projecting them, you're also hearing counter thoughts, and you might actually change your mind. And that's okay. That's how we all get better. Something that Robert also noted earlier is that he actually loves Vancouver, so I'll be able to send a little bit of this current gray sunshine this way back out to you in Chicago. That's just for you, Robert. Our fourth and final panelist is Rachel Gertz, who's one of the founders of Louder Than 10 and who's developed the apprenticeship program that has assisted at least one person in our panel today and others in the future in a current cohort. So she recently relaunched a company as an apprenticeship to help close the skills gap in tech. She recognizes that healthy projects need a solid project manager, and I think we all know that. She's an international speaker and chairs the Vancouver Digital Project Management Meetup Group. She can wax philosophy for hours talking about the future, automation, AI, and human psychology. That sounds like a full bottle of wine conversation, and I think that's actually very appropriate. Because of that, she's also has a personal, I'm gonna add the word commitment. She did, not her words, but I'm gonna say that she has committed herself to be not the first, not the 10th, but in respect to Elon Musk's vision of bringing the human conscience and artificial intelligence together and marrying that, she'd be willing to be one of those top 10 individuals to be the test subject for that. Emphasis on test. Can't wait to see how that comes about. Without further ado, I'd like to initiate a first question with one of our panelists and begin this conversation. And the first question I'd like to pose to you, Dan. So, Dan, what I'd like to ask is, since you've implemented an apprenticeship program within the firm, what has been the most valuable lesson? What's a big learn from your first run with the apprenticeship program?
The first run with the apprenticeship program was an experiment, and it was sort of an accidental experiment. So it wasn't an apprenticeship until the second one. The first one was my brother-in-law, and he was living with his parents, and he wanted a career, and he wanted to propose to his girlfriend, and he couldn't do that off of the odd jobs that he was doing, building pools, managing retail stores, things like that. And he wanted a career, and so we made a deal where he said the house that we moved into needed a lot of work, and he knew how to renovate it. And in exchange for renovating our house, I would train him in being a web developer. And the first time around, we didn't know what that would look like. And so maybe the biggest lesson from the first apprenticeship is that it gave me baselines for, now I know maybe how long this might take. Now I know what are the skills needed. So what we figured out was, I just told him, hang out with me for the next couple of months and let's just see how it goes. What we realized was around the 9-month mark was where he had enough portfolio pieces to put together a thorough portfolio to go and do interviews and interview prep. He had a round amount of skills at that point too. So the 9-month apprenticeship really came from that first time, not knowing how long it would have taken. I would have been happy to have him around for 2 years. I would have been happy to have him around for 3 months. But around that 9-month mark, it became clear that in order to get him to the next level, it might take another 2 years. But this is a good place for him to get an entry-level job and be able to interview for an entry-level job. So I think the biggest lesson is that it gave me baselines. The first time you set any KPIs, it's always kind of a guess. After the first time, now you have some things to kind of measure against. So that was the biggest deal. And if I were to impart that as advice, I would say, the first time, be loose about it. If you're setting up an apprenticeship, be loose about it. Don't be too beholden to your opinions, but gather those baselines so that the next time around it's going to be infinitely better.
Very well said. And the takeaway in there is also to record your process along the way, no matter where you are in the staging, is to always record that. Um, Too many times I think we're looking to others for the answers to the recipe on how to do something, when really what we have to recognize is that, especially in the tech sector, this is a pioneering platform. There's new demands and there's new alternatives to how we go about doing this. And I would also suggest, Dan, that what you will also noted is that there's a improvisation and an adaptive model which needs to come along as you develop a program. So with the 9 months, can I ask how consistent was the training? Like, do you feel that the closer those sessions were, the better the knowledge or retention of learning and that repetitive pattern of learning helped?
Yeah, so I would say similarly to the first apprentice that I had, the second apprentice was infinitely that much more kind of taking it forward. And that what I realized is that those two back to back were very different from each other in personality and what they wanted and outcomes. And that's what's led to the super friendly apprenticeship specifically being very organic. So realizing that that each person wants and needs something different out of it, each person has their own strengths and weaknesses. Everyone's apprenticeship has been very, very different. So I think, kind of speaking to the point that you just made, there are certainly patterns where I can say, all right, this is a good amount of time to learn a particular skill set or particular framework from person to person. And so that's allowed me to kind of make it more self-directed. A lot of the things that we do are do an assignment, self-reflection. What would you like to do next? It's a bit untraditional if you think about a school model where the curriculum for 4 years is laid out for you. You don't have any wiggle room there. But in the apprenticeship, it's more like, what would you like to focus on next? Is your energy in what we just did? Would you like to try something new? Is there something that we missed? Do you want to try it again? So it's a lot of it is self-direction with some guidance to say, if I think an apprentice is going down a path that doesn't serve them well, then I can course correct that a little bit. But a lot of it is driven by them and their desires.
Sounds to me like you've touched on something which is really important that we all need to acknowledge, whether it's physically in front of us or not, and that there's a bit of a trifecta with a successful apprenticeship program. One, of course, is core knowledge and understanding and the basic structure of the skill sets. The second is the human resource themselves, and recognizing that everyone learns at a different pace, level, and a willingness, quite frankly, at times. And the third would be contextualizing that into the environment in which the apprenticeship is happening and making sure that it actually suits those purposes. So when we talk about the failings of education or the positivity of education, what we're seeing here, if I may be so bold as to confront this, having been decades in both sectors, is to recognize that apprenticeship addresses the need to move at the speed of industry. And education recognizes the need for cohesive, consistent measurables at the speed of academia. And they're two different cadences, and they're two different conversations. And so one is that foundation of, is this what I want to do? Is there enough interest? And the apprenticeship seems to elevate that education into the spectrum of, now let's contextualize this and recognize me as a human being and my personal skill set.
If I could respond to that quickly, I think one of the things that apprentice, when you think about an apprenticeship, one of the things that comes to mind is often how in the medieval times blacksmiths were apprenticed. And if you think about the way that worked, you didn't go to blacksmith school. You didn't just learn how to make horseshoes all day and then you go home and do what else you want. As an apprentice, as a blacksmith apprentice at 8 years old, you go and move in with an apprentice. Move in with a blacksmith, and you'd live with them for 7 years. And you'd learn how to make horseshoes and how to craft metal, but you'd also learn how to bill a customer, how to talk to them when they come in, how to clean your room, how to make your bed, how to cook for the people that you're living with. And so I think one of the big things about apprenticeship is that it's not just the course of study that you're doing, but it's all the surrounding stuff. It's a holistic education, and the educational system doesn't cater to that nearly as much as an apprenticeship can.
Absolutely, and very, very well said, Dan, and recognized. And I would suggest that anybody that had an opportunity to apprentice with you would benefit greatly, because you do see that. And there's absolutely no way that academia could actually replicate that environment. And it didn't just happen in medieval days, it's still going on. There's still blacksmiths and sushi chefs that are currently running through that same aspect. We've just neglected it in the tech sector because, well, we're just starting the tech sector. So Now let's talk about the benefits of apprenticeship programs. So we talked about the learning and the takeaway from developing one. Let's now put the question to Becca. And Becca, what I'd like to ask you is, what was the biggest takeaway? What was the highlight of learning from your training in the apprenticeship program?
Yeah, that's a great question. And hi, everyone. I would say the biggest benefit of an apprenticeship, and this is alluding back to what Dan was just saying about the immersive experience, is that, I had this inkling that maybe project management would be something that I'd like to do. Maybe that's a career that I'd like to pursue, but getting a job right away is really difficult. And also, like, personally understanding what that job would be like on a day-to-day basis is really difficult. It's very easy to talk to people that are in the industry and hear their experiences, but getting that firsthand experience and almost having my opportunity, my apprenticeship was 10 weeks long, getting that opportunity throughout the 10 weeks to really see what the day-to-day would be like at an agency, what actual work would I be doing. That was the biggest takeaway. I would say the second biggest takeaway was actually learning a lot about the context of the work, learning about, okay, so I work at Viget. What does Viget actually do? What do those teams actually do? What is the work we produce for our clients? So I think those are the two things, is understanding myself, hey, is this a career that I want? That's a huge benefit of an apprenticeship. It's sort of a low-risk way to try something out, to learn a lot and be really immersive in that experience.
Wonderful, that's fantastic. And it's also what I really appreciate hearing, and seems to be coming up more and more often, is that there's this necessity and requirement to have an allowance from both the potential project manager and the employer to see if there actually is a fit. To see, and I don't mean just fit culturally, but skill set, but also willingness. And if I might use, I'll play the old man card right now and say, youth today have got this, has this incredible vivaciousness to this desire to want to do well, and they want to be challenged, and they want to be thrown into the fire, which can both be a naive approach to understanding a career trajectory and also the most wonderful exploratory way of diving in and learning. And I think there's this recognition that we've got, this much time and this much we want to do, and we need to fit in as much as possible. Now, with that, there's also fear of burnout. So I'm going to go back to that comment about we need that integration point to recognize what we're actually in store for. And when you see that alive and well in the industry that you're looking to challenge yourself in, you then get a better gauge and idea as to what you're in store for versus what your imagination might have put into your mind at the time. Wonderful, thank you for that. I'm just going to move a question over to Robert at this time. And because, Robert, you've been working with developers in-house and mentoring them along the way, have you had client engagement with that? And what I mean by that is how have your clients responded to understanding that there is a mentorship program at play, and how do they feel about it?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, our apprenticeship program is entirely in-house. And so we sort of divide the apprenticeship that people go through into phases where they spend some time doing self-study and sort of leveling up with their skill set. They spend some time getting their feet wet, working with other apprentices on group projects, internal applications, that sort of thing. But then the third phase of their apprenticeship, they're actually pairing with our crafters on client engagements. And so at daily stand-up, I've been in situations where I've said, okay, I'm going to be working on this today, and I'll be pairing with my apprentice here. And the feedback we've gotten to that is really positive. The model we have here is that everyone who develops for us goes through our apprenticeship program. And so I think our clients sort of know that if you have a developer on your team, that person has gone through our process, they've been vetted, they're sort of invested in our shared principles of continually learning and sharing what we know through teaching other apprentices. So generally the feedback has been very positive. One caveat to that is that we're not billing for hours that an apprentice is, sort of shadowing on a client project. So for them, it's almost, I guess, sort of free labor in a sense, where they know that we're cultivating the next generation of developers, and they get to see those people going through the process.
Interesting, an interesting choice of words with the free labor. Obviously, When we talk about an internship program, it's very different from an apprenticeship-based program. Internships should be academically motivated and credited along the way. And sometimes industry will use that term just to get free labor. And so what, obviously, sorry, maybe it's not obvious, but let's state what should be obvious. An apprenticeship is a paid individual immersed into the culture and environment of the industry, learning and serendipitously teaching, because we all learn from everyone that we teach. And but that's not free labor. It might be free hours for your client, and that's the value recognition. So that, I think what we're hearing here is a value add for the client and an opportunity to be engaged. This is a total aside, but I'm going to put this out there and say that if you're introducing your apprentice to the client and they're in the room at the time, I'd almost want to provide an opportunity for the client to ask a question back to the apprentice. Say, hey, how can we share that? What can I learn from your learning so far? Because I find that most clients want to know more about what we do, but don't have the time to tuck in too deeply, nor should they. They're relying on our expertise.
Yeah.
You brought up, sorry, go ahead, Rob.
I was just going to say, if I could follow up on that, I think you put that, more eloquently than I did even. So it is definitely a value add for the clients, and it's an investment that we're making in our future workers. But we have had clients actually be so interested in the program that we've helped them to build their own apprenticeship programs in-house. So I think that it can be a really valuable model that sort of spreads by osmosis.
That is really good to hear, because as we noted earlier, there has been a long tradition of apprenticeship and interning to grow within craft-based industries. And looking at this apprenticeship program now built out of necessity, whereas before it was tradition. And so to reignite that energy of apprenticeship programs being inserted into any genre or any classification of industry, just starting in this place here. But since we're on the topic of finances, and since we're in that range of costs, etc., I'm going to put this to Rachel right now. And if we're going to look at what is actually the cost of running an apprenticeship, like, and who takes on that cost, and how do we share that load so that everyone benefits?
Hey everyone, so that's a really good question, and I don't know if we maybe take a little contrarian view on this. So we strongly feel that when you invest in an apprentice and when you are bringing someone onto your team, we really want to ensure that they are paid fairly. It's really tough, especially living in Vancouver. People are paying more than 50% of their salaries for their rent or mortgages. People are leaving because they can't afford to work here. So if we're not paying them a rate that they can afford to live, then that's the first step, right? In addition to that, though, we're actually asking that the organizations that take them on consider also paying for that training. Now, if you put that training cost on the student, you can't do that. And they will definitely work that off on their own. They will totally see the benefit. But if you show that student, that apprentice, we want you to stay, we are committed to your growth, and that is an aside, and it's not like you have to work it off. It's like a support and a trust in that apprentice. We know that apprenticeships are mostly cost neutral. They end up within months paying themselves off with returned revenue, saved costs, reduced risk, better relationships, and then not to mention just keeping talent, because the teams that you run are happier. So yeah, so I don't know, maybe we're contrarian that way. I'd like to hear from other panelists too and see if that's something that's different.
We can put that to either Dan or Rob. Any comments on what the cost is? And we know what the cost of not doing it can be, but let's talk about that fiscal measure on that. Let's start with Dan.
Sure. So Rachel, I will be contrarian to your contrarian. I actually don't pay my apprentices to start. There's no hourly rate or salary that they get. And part of the reason for that is because I don't look at it as free labor. I more look at it, and Rob, Jonathan, as you mentioned in your intro, I write and think a lot about being paid for value and creating value. And so I look to an apprentice to earn pay. And part of what I do is I invest in them. And the way I look at it is I invest in them, and I want that investment to pay off for both of us. But I think that they benefit more, so I'd like to see that investment from them. So to start, and especially because I work with a lot of apprentices that are career switchers, they're not already in the field that are and learning to get better, they're career switchers. So they're substitute teachers or Uber drivers or photographers or retail employees that want to learn more about development and design. So what I do is I split the difference between, if you were in school for 9 months, you'd pay a pretty hefty tuition. If you were getting paid for 9 months, you'd make a pretty penny. Splitting the difference is, I don't pay anything, you don't pay anything. We're here on our own volition, both of us, and we both invest in each other, and then we'll create value together, and that value pays to both of us. So what that means is, for the first 3 months of the apprenticeship, where they're building up, Jonathan, you kind of phrase it as core knowledge. When they're building up that core knowledge, I'm not paying them anything. I'm not paying them anything to learn that core knowledge, nor are they paying me to learn that core knowledge. Once they've built up that core knowledge, now we work on, again, like I mentioned with the blacksmiths, everything around the craft. You've learned the craft. Now I'd like you to pitch me. I'd like you to propose how you're going to get paid on this project. And that's a real trying process for a lot of apprentices, is to figure out, how do I add value here? The difference between that and sort of saying fend for yourself, self-starter, is that I'll throw them a bone every now and again and say, try this. And in a negotiation where you wouldn't get the other person to say, if you came in too high, the other person says thanks, but no thanks. In this negotiation, I say thanks, thanks, but no thanks, but here's why I'm saying no thanks. And we work on that together, and we iterate over that process in the same way that we iterate over design or development or anything tech related. And so from a cost standpoint, eventually what ends up happening is, for the first project, they're generally paid very low. I usually pay a project rate. And then as they get better and better, they can request more, they can propose more, they can take more work away from me and away from other team members, and they can earn more and more. So a lot of the pay scale increases as their value increases, as they gain a set of skills. I try to use that as motivation for them to grow more quickly, because as they grow more quickly, they can command more of that respect and command more of that value and capture that back. On average, what I've paid my apprentices over the 9 months is $7,000. That's not a lot of money for somebody to not have another job. I asked them for four or 5 days a week. To not have a job for 9 months is tough. And to only get paid $7,000 over that course of the 9 months is tough. And the way that I look at it is that it's an investment, and I define that as a short-term loss to get to a long-term gain. So if you can stomach $7,000 as an investment for 9 months, will that get you that $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year job once you come out of the other end, if you've invested in that, and if I've invested in you? So it's certainly an unpopular viewpoint in not starting apprentices by paying them, but sort of having them earn their pay along the way, and increasingly in scale as their skill set increases.
It's interesting. So we bring up all kinds of ethics and business practice and considerations for spec work and things like that as well. So always wonderful to open any kind of Pandora's box along the way. What I did like hearing, though, was that there was an appreciation for the fact that there's a career switch going on, and that's kind of a mentoring component before intern, before education, before apprenticeship. Whereas, what does that career actually look like, and can I have a window or a day in the life to recognize what that might be, and setting that core base there. We're all going to have different approaches and different opportunities. One thing that I would like to add in that is that sometimes those models are built out of necessity. Sometimes those models are built out of opportunity. And when it comes to opportunity and accessibility, the only comment I would add to that is that that model sometimes creates privilege, because someone who does not have the finances to be able to survive in those situations, yet may be more talented and more committed to the end game, could be neglected. And that's, I'm not judging. What I am doing is pointing that out, because we all have an opportunity to recognize what we can or cannot give, and to make sure that that is being addressed. And we all need to do that together. So that's where we go back to Dan's point earlier, that this is community and that we're all in this together. I'm now going to spin it over to Rob, or sorry, Rachel, did you have a comment on that?
I was just wondering if I could play off what Dan was talking about, because Dan, I do think you have some really valid points. And I think part of what maybe with a project management apprenticeship specifically, like what we're looking at is no matter where these folks are coming from, they're instantly going to be valuable to the organization because they're good communicators, highly organized, they're already good critical thinkers. And so they can bring value back immediately, right? Within a week or two, they're already like helping set schedules and coordinate meetings, and they're looking at processes. And so that's one side of the coin. And then the other side of that same coin is that we're basically looking at allowing folks to start at something that would be considered like market rate or entry-level salary. But then by the end of the program, they're going to be a mid-level person. So essentially that company is paying a junior salary to get someone who's got the experience and skill set of someone who's in that median level. So I don't know, that could just differ because of our, like we're in the same industry, but PM and design. I don't know, what do you think?
It's a very good point, and I think, like I said, every apprenticeship model is going to have variations and deviations depending on the context and the individual and what their abilities are. Yeah, you know, I'm going to bite my tongue right now for this moment, because I want to pass it back to Rob and go back to that question about, you know, the cost, because I think a lot of times, because I know a number of our listeners are agency owners, and they're saying, okay, well, that's all fine and dandy, and yeah, I'd love to train and I'd love to bring people on board, but I don't have the time or the money to do so. So let's talk about what those resources actually look like. And Dan gave a great overview of that from his angle and his insertion point for the apprentice. So I'd like to put that to Rob now.
Yeah, so we have a few different actually types of apprenticeships, because, you know, our idea is that we'd like to teach anyone who has a willingness to learn, but what that looks like depends on where the person who's coming in is at. So if I could speak just from my own experience, when I first got interested in development, I was a debate coach, and I did not have a lot of experience developing software. I had used one language, I had written some small programs, and that was about it. So I applied to our student apprenticeship program, which is an unpaid position where we're just trying to help people sort of achieve their own goals. It doesn't involve any sort of the shadowing on client projects that I was talking about earlier. You're really just kind of getting that feedback loop with a mentor, someone who has more experience and can provide you with some guidance along the way. So I completed that student apprenticeship, and then I applied for a resident apprenticeship, which is our sort of position that's made available for people who actually want to join the company in a paid role. And that was a paid position, and that took me about 7 months to complete. And then after that is when I was finally able to become a crafter here. We have another apprenticeship position that's geared toward people who might have multiple years of experience in the industry. Those people are going to expect a full salary, but we still want them to go through the apprenticeship program so that we can spend some time instilling our principles and so forth. So, you know, it totally makes sense to me that depending on your industry, depending on your needs, you might, you know, fall on different sides of this pay spectrum, but ultimately that these different programs can provide people with an opportunity to learn no matter where they're at or what their goals might be.
Very well said. Really appreciate that. And it also speaks to ROI. So if we're going to talk about return on investment, and we look at what the bottom line is for a senior agency or even a smaller boutique agency and bringing somebody on board to make that inclusive, I want to hit that from two angles. I think that one component to this from both Rachel and Rob, probably when we're talking about large scale firms. So let's talk like 40 plus people, where we're dealing with dozens of potential members of parts of teams. And, you know, inserting an apprentice is almost a no-brainer. Like, let's get someone else in here that we can handle the work, we can share this with. But how do you tell your boss that? How do you go to the CFO, the COO, or whoever may be adding too many letters to the end of their name and saying, this is worth it? Like, how do we sell that? And I know we all have ways to approach that, especially Rachel and Rob, because Rob, you're living it, and Rachel, you're living it and selling it. But I'm going to put this to Becca. Like, Becca, how are you viewed by the leaders and the key stakeholders of your company? And when they talk to you, do they feel like they've brought in something important and of value through that mechanism?
Well, I mean, first off, I surely hope so, because I'm still working here. But second, I mean, the way we sort of talk about it now, and there's been another PM apprentice since I since I had the first one back in 2015. And the way we talk about it now is it's really a 10-week long interview. It's really an interview process for both sides, and for both sides to really test the waters with each other. You know, as Rachel was alluding to, like there's just a lot of like process learning that you have to do when you're a PM in particular, but you come in with a ton of value right off the bat. By my second week, I was already helping my mentor with her projects, actually getting to do work on actual client projects. By the end of the apprenticeship, I ran my own project. So I really was producing value during that apprenticeship, and a lot of it. So I think really it's just think of it as a long interview process, in one where you might be paying someone, but at the same time they're helping you with the work and they're helping distribute that load.
I'd like to classify this now because, like I said before, this is pioneering. You know, it's based on old philosophies and tangents and traditions of inclusivity and sharing of what used to be secret information. You know, when you talk about a very niche skill set, there was this old way of hanging on to that and proving your worth before that information could be shared. And now being in a accessible and a shared economy for both knowledge and access, we have to rethink that, and we have to be more open and transparent and more giving of that time. I'd like to rephrase what you just said. I'd like to rephrase like that insertion point of an apprenticeship program. And when you said it was a 10-week interview, that really resonates. That resonates on so many levels. And I'd like to promote the idea that this is the new probation. Whereas a probation period for a new hire is, okay, you can come on board now, wow me, show me what you can do, and don't get in my way, and you better be worth it. And all those expectations, whether they're clear or not, are not always deliverables that can be met, because there's nervous energy, there's onboarding, there's learning. There's all those things that are giving the person, you're not giving them the tools to be successful. An apprenticeship is giving them the tools to fail or succeed. And I'm going to use the analogy I use many times when we get into a difficult situation with team members. I say, you know, all we need to do is give them 6 feet of rope. They're either going to climb out of that hole with it, or they're going to hang themselves with it. Either way, everyone knows it, everyone wins, and everyone just moves on. And maybe that's a bit of a drastic oversight of what an apprenticeship can be. I don't think Rachel's packing 6 feet of rope with every apprenticeship package now with the curriculum. But I love the idea of the 10-week interview, and I love the idea of a new probation period, which is inclusive and also puts the onus equally on both parties. Is that fair? Does anybody want to comment on that and say whether we could implement that as a new structure for apprenticeship?
I'll start. That's tough for me, honestly, to hear. And the reason for that is because, and certainly it's my bias and the apprentices that I work with, if they interviewed on the first day as career switchers, they wouldn't pass the interview. So even to get to that interview point takes me and the person working with the apprentice a long time to give them those tools, as you mentioned, to fail or succeed. Sometimes they don't even know what the tools are. So part of that learning process is, this is a tool, here's how you use it. Oh, okay, cool. Like, I think I know what that means. Let me show you what that means, and let's test out what that means. So even before that probation period, I think that there's especially if you're bringing people into this field, which I hope we talk about a little bit, there's a little bit of this period of, let's equip them to pass the interview, right? It's a little bit of a cheat sheet. So I think one of the ways that I think about apprenticeship is as it relates to career switchers or people that are new to the industry, is let's give them the tools to succeed. Let's give them the tools to more likely succeed than fail. And then when they have the interview, they're like, oh, I've got the cheat sheet for this one, you know? And so I like the idea, and I think that it's a great idea to say, someone coming in, I love the extended interview idea, you know, to hire someone who's going to be productive for you for the next 3 years based on an hour sitting down with them and looking through their portfolio. And, you know, if they have one, that's a long shot. But to be able, you know, I've heard of companies that will, you know, they'll hire you for a project if you can do that, if you can carve off a week, you know, if you're, and hire you for a project, and you come and meet the team, and you go out bowling together, and you see if you're a fit all around. And I love apprenticeship as a model for interviewing, but I also think that with certain apprentices, if they don't have the tools yet, I think there's a probationary period even before that of, let's give you the tools, let's give you the cheat sheet so that you pass the interview.
Yeah, well said. And I think what you're pointing out, and I'd love to extend this conversation further, because it sounds to me like we're also partitioning apprenticeship programs for accessibility. Because when it comes to experience, what we're hearing from the design and developer spectrum with Dan, to someone who's come out of school that's been trained in project management is now looking for that insertion point into agency. You know, we've got levels of experience from none to naivete to novice. And then there's the, well, no clue. You know, that we've got a number of ranges that we need to be very, very considerate of. So thank you very much for pointing that out. And to Rachel's point earlier, is that it's hard to compare a program depending on the needs of the individual or the awareness of the individual. Yeah, well done, well said. We have a few minutes before we open it up to public Q&A. But what I'd like to extend on a little bit more is maybe the foundation of how you set up, because I'm hoping that people are here listening to the tools to initiate a program that isn't too overwhelming for the current structures already in play with the company. And so I'm going to put that to Rachel right now. So if you could summarize quickly, like what would be the prerequisite or pre-qualifiers or the criteria to initiate a stakeholder to take on an apprenticeship program?
Again, I'm probably coming from a little bit of a different angle, because we are providing the training as a service to offload and offset all of that onboarding debt that most companies struggle with when they are bringing new folks on, or even just kind of having leveled up on current folks on their team. So what we can do is we'll basically be saying, do you have someone on your current team who you think, with a little bit of love, with some support, would be able to be better at his or her position? If so, then we would look at scheduling that out, and it would be a one-year program, week to week, where we sit down virtually, just like this, and we would have a curriculum. So we would apply the theory, and then we would also allow for, there'd be a chance to do simulation projects, but with the natural feel of a project cycle. So it's not forcing it into a really short time frame, but actually providing the support as a follow-up to say, okay, how is that going? What are you struggling with your real team? What kinds of things can we address early on? So we kind of call that a spiral curriculum, and we loop it back. So at a glance, it's a year program with the support built right into it.
Excellent. Rob, do you want to touch on what you initiated or what you saw initiated around you, and what structure was there when you began?
Yeah, so I mean, our company began with an apprenticeship model. Like, we brought on our first new hires via apprenticeship, but we've definitely iterated on the process several times as we've sort of learned new things about what works and doesn't work. To someone who is trying to get a program started, you know, my advice would be to try and find out who in your organization is available to potentially provide some mentorship, and what are your core values, because from there you can sort of structure a curriculum and, you know, potentially provide some time for that mentor to provide apprenticeship services to a new hire. I did like some of what you were saying earlier about, instead of treating new hires as if they're on probation, if we treat them as if they're on an apprenticeship, maybe we give them the time and the resources they need to learn and get a lot better. Some of the things we've learned about sort of how to make it work better, we've sort of distributed apprenticeship. So instead of just having one mentor for one apprentice, we have several mentors who work with one apprentice. You know, I talked about the phases that apprentices go through a little bit earlier, so you get exposure to different parts of the consulting and development workflow. And we've got a review board that sort of determines at the end whether or not an apprenticeship has been successful and they will be joining the company in a full crafter role. And so one thing we've been focused on is making sure that there's early exposure between the apprentice and that review board for people to work together and sort of get that osmosis happening.
Wonderful. So really a lot of synergy, and you're also piggybacking the enthusiasm of those that wish to share their knowledge. You know, and I think that's really important to understand, is that if you're going to develop the structure of an internship, actually, if you're going to develop the structure of an internship, an apprenticeship, or an onboarding, you have to have buy-in from those that are already on the team. You can't be adding more work to someone who's overworked.
And, you know, I think that especially in software development, sort of in some ways, our job is to keep learning. And I think you mentioned out at the top, sort of, if you want to be an apprentice, you should be mentoring someone. I think part of what goes into that is that mentorship is a really valuable way to learn, to practice the things that you sort of know implicitly, make them explicit, and transfer that knowledge among your organization. You know, it's popular in software development to do pair programming where two people sit at the same computer and work at the same thing, because that facilitates knowledge transfer that might be implicit among the individuals. And I think the same thing happens with sort of mentorship and distributed mentorship, where skill sets that you might not know someone else doesn't know, or you might not know you don't know, can be transferred in a fluid fashion.
Absolutely. Well said. I'd like to put this to Becca now. So now you've been with the company for a year, almost a year and a half now after graduation with the program, did your company already have an internship program? Was that already in play? And if so, what has been addressed to denote the difference between the two?
Yeah, so Vickett's had an internship program that occurs over the summer for college students primarily, and that really the main difference there is that there's like an internship class. So we have maybe a development intern, maybe a front-end development intern, maybe also a design intern. So there's a whole class, and they're really working on an internal project together. We don't put them on client work. Really, it's a learning experience for those interns. The apprenticeship's a little different in that it's not part of a class. It's usually one person at a time. And what you're really doing is you're shadowing one mentor. It's a bit slightly shorter of a program, or maybe about the same length, but it's not necessarily over the summer, and you are working on client work. So the idea is that you've definitely probably graduated college already. You might have been in the workforce for a year or two, and you're interested in that career, or maybe making a career switch. So slight differences, but one of the big ones is the ability to work on client work or not work on client work.
Fantastic. So we're seeing and a question had arisen before about what is the difference between internship and apprenticeship, and we did allude to one being more academic and what you said about a class, and that's kind of like that studio component to the self-directed and self-evaluated at times, and self-inserted into industry as well, and just to make those connections possible. Whereas the apprenticeship is that next level, that next layer, where you know enough now to be dangerous. And I love that term. We're like, I've just learned enough now to be dangerous. I can both hurt myself or others, or I can help myself and help others. And that's that beautiful place of learning and exposure and sharing. I'm gonna now say thank you all so much for your putting up with my questions and sharing the information you did. And now with the last 15 minutes, we're gonna turn this over to questions from our audience. And one of the questions was, well, what is that difference between internship and apprenticeship? And I hope that we've addressed that. And just looking to get some questions from our audience now. So I'm gonna put that over to our admin team that's collecting them now, and hopefully they'll show up soon. But in the interim, and sorry, just to give credit back to the question about internship versus apprenticeship, that was from Steve Bissonnette, and so thank you, Steve. I appreciate you asking that question. And now we've got a question from Trevor Ramage. And does anyone on the panel see this growing into a more traditional apprenticeship program that combines a couple of months in a class time with months of industry experience? And that's interesting, because now that's kind of a hybrid between the idea of intern versus apprentice, and also a hybrid about payment versus credit. So knowing what you've been through, and especially recent graduates and recent implementers of apprenticeship programs, do you see that opportunity? Do we have an opportunity here to combine the two and create a new model of apprenticeship, a new tradition? I'll open that up to anyone. Let's start with Dan on that one.
So that's close to how some of my apprentices are working now. Not all of them. So I mentioned it's pretty organic, and it's pretty driven by the apprentice themselves. Some apprentices learn well by being taught things. Some learn by watching. Some learn by reading. Some learn by being told things. And so some of the apprentices, for example, when they're learning development, it's really easy for me to say to them, okay, complete this Treehouse course, or complete this, this online, this Code Academy lesson or module, and then we're going to talk about it. And that's part of the learning. So some apprentices have learned that way. Others have said, it doesn't really work for me, and I will teach them HTML instead in sort of a hands-on environment. So I think that hybrid model, there's a lot, I've seen a lot of success with that. I think it's very tailored to the particular apprentice, and that's why I think that is a challenge of scale, because it becomes very difficult to assess that even in a class, in a cohort of 15, than it does if you've got 2 or 3 at a time. So if you have 2 or 3 at a time, you can vary the teaching methods, and then they also end up helping each other. If you've got 10 or 15 or 20 at a time, it's a lot more difficult, and it becomes more efficient and just more economical to say, okay, all 15 of you do a treehouse course, and then as a class we'll review this, and then that veers more toward that kind of academic model rather than the apprenticeship model. So I think size has a good deal to do with how you integrate that.
Yeah, well said, and scaling accordingly. And plus you bring up the tipping point theory as well, is that when you get to a certain size of cohort or intake, it could spin into a negative spiral, or it could elevate everyone's ability and opportunities. So having 2 or 3 closely guided and nurtured and collaborating you're able to elevate from a peer level. The worst case scenario is a lateral move. Best case scenario is that everyone learns, including those that are officiating the training. Wonderful. Does anybody else want to touch on that question about the hybrid opportunity? Rachel, can you discuss?
I was going to add too, like we're building that sort of school/experience component together, right? We've got apprentices working full-time in the organization environment, but in addition, they're also learning the theory and application. So we're sort of covering all the bases in terms of process and professional development, as well as soft skills and hard skills, because again, like it's that nurturing of those soft skills that we're finding now. Those communications bachelor degrees are really coming in handy. And as automation keeps impacting us, and we do look at total transitions and transformations in the types of jobs that are out there, our secret goal is to try to empower people who are very good critical thinkers and highly emotionally intelligent with the skills that they need on both sides of that fence to be able to just run with them, and then basically do and adapt any kind of role where they can serve others, including, if it came down to it, I mean, we have a mega thrust earthquake on the way. Wouldn't it be great if project managers could just jump in?
Totally.
So that's my, yeah.
That's fantastic. I really appreciate that. I'm actually, with that discussion going in that way, I'm actually going to pose a challenge to any educators or senior education officials, whether they be private or public institutions, especially with the advent of quick learning required in development sector and tech sector, where if you're waiting for a degree in programming for today, then you're probably 4 years behind before you get out of school. And so I'm going to put the challenge out to any educators listening, is that to go and talk to Rachel about what is it like to look at that time after your student receives their certificate, degree, acknowledgement, pat on the back, whatever accolade you give them, and to remember that there's more to it than the end of your term. You are letting that person into the wild, and then the onus is on you to ensure that they've got the best means necessary to get there. And it sounds like we've got 5 people right here that want to help that happen. And so I'll put the challenge out to educators to begin that conversation with all of us at some point, so that we can marry the internship with apprenticeship and everyone wins. I'm going to bring up a question that's come up. A number of people have been requesting and asking and talking about, when it comes to paying for this, and we know what the cost would be to not do these things, and how the tangible versus intangible. That's the fact that not everyone has the means to afford an education. Not everyone has the means to take time away from the job that they have to survive, so that they can learn and accelerate themselves. And so career switching becomes both a dangerous and a risky endeavor, especially, there's people with families, there's people with situations that are completely beyond our control. There's those that are from marginalized communities. There are, if we insert everything, there's gender bias, people of color, there's like I said, the marginalized communities, those that are in recovery programs. And everyone needs a chance, and everyone should have equal opportunity. And we all say that, but how do we practice that? And so I'm going to put the question to Dan at this time, and just say, from your experience, what have been some of the success stories? Like, how do we ask someone to take the bite out of their income, and what tools have they discovered to be able to take a lower income and still a higher value of education in your apprenticeship program?
It's a tough question. It's a very tough question, and I have maybe some unformulated answers and some unpopular, frankly, answers. But I'll sort of think out loud a little bit about it, and share some stories about it. So I think one of the things there is, and Jonathan, you mentioned this earlier, is that in a lot of what we're talking about, we're assuming an amount of privilege. And what that means is, what privilege means, as I understand it, is privilege is an advantage, whether earned or not. And so partly what we're saying here is, in order to participate in something like this, you need to have some form of advantage. Because if you don't have advantage, then likely, from what we've been talking about, it's hard to break into that, especially in the model I'm talking about, where I say I don't pay people, right? So in order to take 9 months of no pay or little pay, you have to be advantaged enough to be able to do that. I think there's a couple of assumptions too to address. So I think, Jonathan, one of the ways that you keyed it up was, you say, how can you expect people, or how can you ask people to take a bite out of their income to be able to do this for 10 weeks or 12 weeks or 9 months? And I think that part of the thing to address is that for a lot of my apprentices, they're not taking a bite out of their income. They don't have the income, right? And that's part of the problem, is that they don't have the income to be able to do this. And so what I tend to do in interviewing apprentices, I can't interview for portfolio. I can't say, well, let's see if your portfolio looks good enough, and then you can be an apprentice, because they don't have a portfolio if they're a substitute teacher. Instead, what they have is motivation. So I interview for motivation. I try to assess, are they motivated enough in the low times they'll be able to get through. And a lot of my interviewing for potential apprentices is talking them out of being an apprentice and asking them over and over again, are you sure you can do this? Are you sure you're going to be able to stick it out for 9 months? Are you sure you can forego an income for 9 months? And a lot of my apprentices frankly say, look, I don't have the income anyway. I'm not actually giving up any more than I'm giving up right now, just living the way that I live. So that's one potential answer. Another answer is that, and again, I touched on investment earlier, some apprentices see it as an investment, and they say, well, I know that you say you can't have a part-time job, but I need a part-time job. I promise to get the work done. I promise to do the investment. I promise to be tired for 9 months, but still get it done. I'm going to get a part-time job. And I go, all right. So some apprentices have driven for Uber. Some have worked part-time at retail on nights and weekends. Some have been tired. Some have been stressed, but they see that as an investment. And then the last thing is, some of my apprentices have used some of their skills in very non-traditional ways. And as an example, I've had some apprentices that, were landscapers before and would tell me, hey, I'm short on cash this week. Can I mow your lawn? Sure, I'll give it, yeah, okay, sure. And that's not a traditional apprentice model, but that's me using whatever little advantage I have to be able to kind of get back there. So I don't think that any of those are right answers or popular answers. I think those are the reality of the situation, is that some people, and I think, I'll close with this to say that some people, the answer for them is for them to say, I don't think I can do an apprenticeship at this time. I can't make the investment right now. In the same way that if I wanted to invest in a stock, but I don't have any money lying around, I can't make the investment. I'm not going to get the return because I can't make the investment. That's okay. It's okay if you can't make the investment. If somebody can help you to get to the point to make an investment, whether that's the person running the apprenticeship, or hey, taking a loan from the bank, or refinancing your house, or whatever, those are tough things to do. But if you see it as an investment that will have high return for you, for the person, it may be the right investment. And it's also okay for the person to say, no, it's not the right investment for me right now, or even ever.
Very well said, and I really appreciate that perspective on that, Dan. And it also harkens back to the fact that table can be turned. We have an opportunity here to look at, we're discussing how an apprentice enters into the environment, but Dan, as you alluded to, there's also the risk and the cost that could be associated to an agency owner, and how far they're willing to go. So although those responses or solutions could be contentious or privileged or wonderful, that's very scalable, and that exists within a mom and pop shop and a 100-person firm. And to recognize that there's always going to be risk, there's always going to be sacrifice, there's always going to be a work ethos, and to do what you feel you need to do, depending on your personal circumstances and your professional circumstances, to achieve your objective. and to celebrate that achievement of your objective. And when you see someone who wants to do something badly enough, I think that everyone on this panel would find all the ways necessary to see that through. Thank you. In closing, I just want to say thank you so much to our panel members, to Becca, Dan, Rachel, and Rob. Thank you all so much for sharing your insight, your experience, your enthusiasm, and I'd also like to add, I'd like to thank you for your passion. You know, a lot of what is happening here that is the intangible is that none of us have to do this. No one's being forced to do this. We want to do this because we know that our industry is better for it. And so I want to acknowledge that. And I want to tell you that I see you and I see what you're doing for our industry. And I thank you for that. And so thank you all for being here. Thank you all for listening in and bringing in your questions. There was some wonderful insight given. There were some great questions asked, but this was only an hour. And we're talking about the rest of your lives, some of you, and your professional careers. And look at that trajectory and look at the opportunities around you. I hope this conversation continues in many platforms. I welcome any of you to reach out to any of our panelists, including myself. And I know that the Louder Than 10 crew has the contact info or at least the social media profiles on their website. And I wish you all a fantastic day, afternoon, evening, wherever you find yourself in the world. And good luck in developing your own apprenticeship programs. And remember to keep teaching and keep learning. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.